Welcome back into Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get the latest on the Middle East. Dr. Alon Burstein joining us, as always, Alon. We appreciate you. Thanks for coming on. We were just talking offline about how this has really been one of the busier weeks in this conflict since, I don't know, it's probably been the busiest week in at least a few months. I want to take a live look at the Israel-Lebanon border. The news of the day was a Hezbollah commander killed in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut's southern suburbs on Friday. It was one of the terrorist group's top military officials in charge of its elite forces and had been on the U.S.'s wanted list for years. His name is Ibrahim Aqil. He's 61 years old. And he's the second top commander of Hezbollah to be killed in an Israeli airstrike in the southern suburb of Beirut in as many months. Alon, why is his death consequential to the larger conflict at hand?
Good to see you, Austin. And yeah, it relates very much to your opening comment. This is the almost busiest week that has been in the war. And when we were talking offline, I said, yeah, probably since the end of July, when we saw the escalation as a result of the missile by Hezbollah that landed in Majd al-Shams, killing 12 teens in northern Israel. And as a result, the assassination of Fuad Shukr, the basically chief of staff of Hezbollah. Ever since Shukr's assassination, there has been a bit of disarray within Hezbollah's ranks. Hezbollah, somewhat unlike Hamas and other forces, actually operates much more like a regular army. It has obviously its covert terror activity and terror wings, and etc. But at the same time, it also has pretty regimented military ranks. In that sense, the death of the commander-in-chief left a big void, but also was immediately filled with another commander. That commander was Ibrahim Aqil. Ibrahim Aqil was the head of operations, chief of operations for Hezbollah. He's also the commander of the Radwan force, that is Hezbollah's elite units. They are the ones who initially came up with the plans of terror groups in the Middle East to invade Israel and occupy certain parts of it. They had a plan that was called the Galilee Plan to take over certain areas in the Galilee. Hamas and their Nukhba forces that carried out October 7th largely learned from them and trained from them. They just beat them to it on October 7th. Assassinating Ibrahim Aqil when we looked at it from that perspective, especially in light of the previous assassination of Fuad Shukr, is another major blow to the organization, and also is a big indication that Israel really has sort of like all gloves are off, all bets are off. And as far as Israel is concerned, if we look at the escalations of the week, at the beginning of the week, the cabinet in Israel voted to add the northern front and restoring the Israeli civilians to the north to the official war aims of Israel. On Tuesday, we saw the detonation of the pagers. On Wednesday, we saw a detonation of walkie-talkies. That unto itself has either killed or severely injured hundreds, if not thousands, of Hezbollah operatives. Then also targeting the most senior military official right now. Israel is indicating very, very clearly that Hezbollah either needs to accept some sort of diplomatic resolution that Israel will agree to also, or that Israel is going to continue escalating towards what will be eventually an all-out war.
You know, I got to ask you, too, it seems there's been an endless amount of conversations over the months about how it's almost inevitable that Israel and Hezbollah will eventually fall into some sort of a larger conflict. Thankfully, we haven't seen it yet. But Alon, if it's felt like a good possibility for so long, why hasn't it happened yet?
To large extents, like many things in the war that you and I have spoken about over coming on a year now, it relates to internal politics. In Israel, the focus of the war has been the southern front. It has been on the fact that there are still 101 hostages that are held in the Gaza Strip. The Hamas movement is still alive. There's still ongoing fighting today, heavy intensive fighting reported in Tel Sultan. So as far as the IDF was concerned and Israel was concerned and internal politics was concerned, shifting the weight of the war towards the north, which would then also encompass more of a regional escalations, Iran, the Houthis, different militias in Syria, didn't seem like an intelligent move, both militarily and very politically. In the same way, for Hezbollah, Hezbollah wants to and ideologically is obligated to be a supporting force to Hamas. It sees in Israel it's a mortal enemy. It is an extension of Iran that also sees as part of its mission to support the Palestinian terror organizations. So Hezbollah sees itself as committed to the war. At the same time, Hezbollah has internal politics to consider. Lebanese economy is decimated. The inflation rate is between 90 to 92% over the last couple of years. There's complete political deadlock there. Hezbollah is still licking its wounds from the amount of soldiers that it lost when they went to fight in Syria to save Assad's regime. There's a lot of anger with them in Lebanon. Why are we sending, our best and brightest to go fight to uphold the dictatorship in Syria? Syria had occupied Lebanon for many years. It's not seen as a friend of Lebanon. So Hezbollah still gets wounds from that and has no interest in being seen as the one who now initiates a war with Israel that reduces Beirut to look the way Gaza looks right now. So internal politics has largely kept both sides in check. The thing that has changed to some extent is, number one, with the advances that the IDF has made in Gaza, the fact that the IDF declared several weeks ago that the Rafah division of Hamas has been defeated. With that, the IDF is signaling it's coming to an end with what it's going to achieve with the military pressure in Gaza, so it has the ability to shift its weight more towards north. In addition to that, the internal pressures on Israel are starting to boil over with regards to the evacuated civilians. There are between 60 to 80,000 civilians that are evacuated from the northern parts of Israel. We're now coming on close to a year. That pressure has started to mount to the point that within the Israeli government, it's become a much more opportune moment to say, okay, it's time to break the stalemate. Israel is indicating that it does not necessarily have to be with an all-out war. It has publicly stated that Nasrallah can stop this if he accepts diplomatic resolutions. So Israel's sort of like giving that option, but also saying, but if not, we're pushing on ahead.
So you've probably seen this reporting. The U.S. has kept an increased military presence in the Middle East throughout much of the past year, with about 40,000 forces, at least a dozen warships, and 4 Air Force fighter jet squadrons spread across the region. If an all-out war were to break out alone, what would the U.S.'s role be? What would all these forces do?
These forces are primarily meant as deterrence, and I don't see them actually getting involved in active fighting unless we really do see a sort of complete breakdown, almost World War III spiraling within the Middle East. And that's what these forces are there to stop. Already on October 7th, actually on October 8th, the United States sent 2 aircraft carriers with its full complement of escorting ships. It also sent other divisions of over 3,000 Marines to the region. And President Biden issued repeated statements warning Hezbollah and Iran. That was a famous don't. Do not enter the war. Do not throw your weight into the war. If you do, you will meet U.S. forces. The United States went as far as to threaten overthrowing Assad's regime in Syria if this happens. Now, if there is an escalation between Israel and Hezbollah that we've seen in the last months, we've seen since the beginning of the war, assuming that does actually escalate and spiral, if it remains between the IDF and Hezbollah, between Israel and Lebanon, chances are we're not going to see the United States intervening. The United States does not want to get embroiled in Lebanon. The United States, the last time it did that, it worked out very badly for them. There's no interest in the United States to be involved in that, on the one hand. On the other hand, if that escalation opens up the floodgates for the Houthis to all of a sudden start launching daily missiles towards Israel, or for different militias within Iraq or Syria to start launching missiles constantly, or even for Iran to intervene, then likely those are the cases where we're likely going to see U.S. forces. We're not going to see them active in the war between Israel and Lebanon. We are likely to see them active in stopping and deterring other actors from getting involved, and that sort of leaving the war between Israel and Lebanon in its own isolated sphere. At least that's what the United States is probably going to try to do.
Multiple senior U.S. officials have reportedly acknowledged that a ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas is unlikely before the end of President Joe Biden's term in office. A U.S. official speaking to the Wall Street Journal on the condition of anonymity said no deal is imminent. I'm not sure it ever gets done. Alon, Biden's term ends on January 20th next year. That's 4 months away. I asked Hal about this yesterday, but I'd love your take too. Is it news to you that a deal isn't expected to be reached in the immediate future? Did it already feel that way?
Yes, the negotiations really have not gone anywhere. Arguably in at least a month, if not 2 months. Really, since that escalation at the end of July, negotiations have completely stalled. If we look at the macro over the last 4 months, there was sort of a breakthrough in May when President Biden laid out a proposal that was said to be accepted by the Israeli government. However, then the Israeli government added new terms, which complicated things. Hamas had still not agreed. Then in July, all of a sudden, Hamas agreed to a certain version of the deal. By then, Israel had taken over, the Philadelphia line and the southern parts of Rafah and was refusing to withdraw from them. That was not part of the original deal because the idea of not taking it over yet. Since then, both sides have simply been at a stalemate. The deal reportedly 90% is agreed on. That's all well and good. However, the 10% that's not agreed on, which is IDF presence in the Netzarim corridor along the Philadelphia line, and also whether or not fighting can resume after 6 weeks, that's been the continuous points of disagreement ever since May. There was a breakthrough in May that maybe Israel agreed to, then a breakthrough in July that Hamas agreed to, and each time they didn't agree enough to make the other side come forward. So there was ongoing negotiations, but it never seemed at any point that any side was going to budge. And I will say also, with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the negotiations took a step back. I've often, as I spoke about before, I've often said that internal politics is what matters. Within Hamas, there were two opposing factions. There was Yahya Sinwar in the Gaza Strip, championing a much more hardline approach towards negotiations. Then there was Ismail Haniyeh, certainly no lover of Israel. He was the official leader of Hamas. However, he thought for strategic purposes that Hamas should go towards a ceasefire, even if it is just for 6 weeks, in order to allow the movement to regroup. With his assassination, Yahya Sinwar has become the ultimate leader of Hamas. He's now unchallenged. He commands both the military forces and he commands the political wing. So with that, it seemed like the deal was only going even further back. That said, I've often said we don't know. There's always a sudden crossroads when all of a sudden something happens in the war and maybe something quick will change. But right now, both sides are much more stuck within their positions, especially with attention going now towards Israel and Hezbollah. Don't see it happening in the coming weeks.
As far as we know, if a ceasefire is reached, whether it's permanent or temporary in Gaza, as far as we know, does that quell all the tension between Hezbollah and the IDF?
So that's the interesting thing that was said this week. And you asked me a couple of days ago about Hassan Nasrallah's speech, and I said he's unlikely to say anything new. And on the one hand, I stand by that. He didn't say a lot new. On the other hand, what he repeated and how he chose to repeat it actually was quite interesting. He said very clearly that no matter what happens, Israel will not be able to return its civilians to the northern parts of Israel until the war in Gaza ends. He said, we said this on October 8th when we joined the war, and we're saying this now, we're a supportive front for Gaza. This has been interpreted by many as an escalatory statement, as saying Hezbollah is not going to accept a ceasefire, is not going to accept any diplomatic resolution, and it is an escalatory statement in that sense. At the same time, it's also important to read between the lines. With that, Nasrallah is saying, I don't want to look at the current round between Hezbollah and Israel as its own war. I don't want to let it spiral into its own war that then has to be resolved between us. To some extent, he is saying, I would be happy to stop the guns tomorrow. Come to a ceasefire in Gaza, I'm happy to stop the guns. Now, one of the other factors, though, Hezbollah is saying that. Israel is unlikely to agree to that. Israel, after the trauma that Israelis suffered after October 7th, is highly unlikely to let its civilians go back to the northern border now with the Redwan force again, as they were carrying out training operations, 2 miles beyond the border. After October 7th, Israel saw what can happen when a terror group decides to all of a sudden activate its forces. So Israel's unlikely to agree that even if the war in Gaza ends, the situation with Hezbollah ends, unless there's some sort of resolution. What we might end up seeing, because Hezbollah is tying those together, is that a broader resolution, if one were to happen, a broader resolution and ceasefire in the war is actually going to have to involve more actors. It's going to have to be more than Israel and Hamas. It may have to be Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Egypt guaranteeing both sides, something like that, because all sides are now tied together. Israel's unlikely to let the situation just go back to how it was in the north. Hezbollah is saying, well, we have to have a ceasefire first, so it's possible that whatever resolution ends up happening will actually involve both fronts within the same deal.
The always informative Alon Burstein, as always. We appreciate your time, and we always look forward to your daily YouTube war updates as well. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Let's slide away. We're going to step away for a quick moment here. We'll be right back.